Okay, welcome everyone. Great to see you all here. Thanks for coming along. Welcome to panel one of adaptation and the Australian novel. I know a few of you, but I'm not known to most of you, I imagine. So I'm Elliot Logan. I'm lecturer in media and communication at the University of Queensland, and I'm coming to you live from Brisbane or Meanjin, which is home to the Turrbal people. The topic of today's panel is methodologies. So each paper on the panel explores new methods for thinking about adaptation, but also looks at distinctive methods used in the practical processes of adaptation in different media. We have four speakers on the panel today: Lewis Treston from the University of Queensland, Piers Wilcox, who's an independent scholar, Catherine Marquette from the University of Queensland, and Hayden Moon from the University of Sydney. We'll have a Q&A session after each paper. Each paper will run for 20 minutes. Because we have four papers on the panel, the Q&A session will be truncated a bit to about 6 minutes or so. At the 18-minute mark in each paper, I'll just let you know each speaker that I have 2 minutes left, and we'll have to be quite strict with time allocations. If you have a question in the Q&A session, either feel free to use the chat or feel free to put your hand up digitally or jump in. We'll have to kind of see how we go and what works most effectively. Okay, so speaker number one is Lewis Treston from the University of Queensland with the paper Adapting in Strobe, Camp Strategies for Adaptations. So I'll turn the session over to Lewis. Thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me all right? Perfect. Okay, so before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the original custodians on the land from which I'm speaking, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I understand that we're also in Zoom land at the moment, so I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional landowners from wherever you're Zooming in today. So hello, thank you for taking the time to be here. My name is Lewis Treston. I'm a playwright, and hopefully I'll soon be a graduate from the MPhil program at the University of Queensland. I submitted last week, so fingers crossed. Over the past 2 years, I've been researching camp humour in new Australian playwriting. In particular, I've been investigating how camp can infiltrate established genres to create various forms of aesthetic and political disruption. Today, I will be speaking about how camp can be applied as a strategy for adaptation. In particular, I will focus on an original term I have developed called writing in strobe. In short, writing in strobe is a parodic mode of performance writing that weaponizes genre conventions that reside in outdated text by shifting or strobing between mimesis and parody. In this presentation, I will demonstrate how I have utilized writing in strobe in my new Jane Austen-inspired comedy Hubris and Humiliation in order to interrogate a range of questions relating to queer marriage. It's my hope that this presentation might inspire camp adaptations of Australian novels for our stages, for better or worse, why not give it a go? And one of the questions implicit within this presentation is what Australian novels could be reimagined through a camp lens, and by extension, what new insights can camp adaptations reveal about the source text and the world that writers create. So I'll leave it with you to contemplate these questions throughout the presentation and the symposium over the next day or so. So there are two key terms in this presentation that I need to unpack so we can understand each other. They are, of course, camp and writing in strobe. So I'll begin with camp because it's the more unpinned downable and sort of amorphous term of the two. So debates over the definition of camp have been ongoing since Susan Sontag's seminal publication Notes on Camp in 1964. So across 58 notes, Sontag shines a light on the camp sensibility's love of the artificial, of artifice and exaggeration. Sontag suggests that camp offers a comic vision of the world that dethrones the serious and with its frivolous and depoliticized sense of things. She observes that camp fixates on out-fashioned, demode, and banal objects of culture that it revives and makes fantastic again. Though Sontag recognizes there is a peculiar relationship between camp taste and homosexuality, she resists defining camp as a homosexual predilection for all things fabulous. While Sontag's discursive writing style repels a sort of totalizing definition of the term, she does divide camp up into two key categories, which are essential for today's presentation, which are naive and deliberate camp. Sontag delineates that pure camp or naive camp is unaware of its camp effect, whereas the less satisfying deliberate camp is ironically aware of its own poor taste. So in reaction to Sontag's apolitical definition of camp, Mo Meyer, in his 1996 Introduction to the Politics and Poetics of Camp, argues that camp is inherently a political performative strategy utilized by queer identities as a parodic resistance to heteronormativity and other modes of domination. So sort of big gesture from him. Drag and theatre artist Charles Ludlam also criticizes Sontag in his manifesto, Ridiculous Theatre, Scourge of Human Folly, my favorite title ever, for Sontag's attempts to characterize camp as literal things like Tiffany lampshades, countering that camp in a broad sense should be viewed as an outsider's point of view. You don't have to actually look much further than Ash Flanders and Declan Green's once backyard, but now main stage Australian theatre group Sisters Grimm to find this evidence of this kind of politically subversive camp theatre. There's a bigger quote from their website up on the screen. I just want to bring your attention to the last line, that they create elaborate pastiches that occupy a space somewhere between homage and critique, which is particularly relevant to what I'll be talking about later. So to put the disruptive political potential of camp to one side, most of the literature concludes that this amorphous term is very difficult to define. Ludlam quite usefully states that I don't think camp can be defined, and Sontag suggests that even talking about camp is a kind of betrayal to the sensibility itself. This begs the question, how can anyone write or talk about camp? So as a strategy within my own work, I've combined Esther Newton, John Wolfe, and Laleen Jaiman's research to form 5 tenets of camp. I'll press a slide. There we go. They are incongruity, theatricality, humor, cross-gender identification, but particular to today's conversation, my original tenet, writing and strobe. So by viewing camp through these tenets, I believe it becomes possible to discuss the term with respect to its definitional imperviousness, while also leaving enough space for it to accommodate multiple perspectives on its political potential. For today's presentation, I will only be defining my original term, writing and strobe. I will make casual reference to the other 4 tenets of camp, which I suspect you'll be able to follow along with because they're not particularly esoteric terms. But if you get totally lost, save your questions for the end. So before I define writing and strobe, I want to unpack the discrete camp qualities within Austen, Austen's novels, I mean, and their adaptations across film and television. I want to do this because I need to contextualize why Austen's body of work is an ideal candidate for writing in strobe. In Davuni Luce's research, she broadly claims that contemporary critical characterizations of Austen's legacy orbits notions that she was a courageous rebel who covertly undermined the artifice of gendered romance. Building upon this foundation, Luce considers Austen's style to be a kind of vanilla camp that does not intend to overwhelm or shock. Instead, it is a safe camp that is indeterminably naive or deliberate in its construction. She suggests that this vanilla camp is evidence through Austen's send-up of gender norms, citing dandy Robert Ferrers from Sense and Sensibility, who in a scene postures for over a quarter of an hour while shopping for the ideal toothpick case as an example for her reference of gendered social protocols. Further to this, Luce also observes that Austen's novels flirt with a sexually inflected camp, which I'm sure is why everyone's here today. To substantiate this point, she refers to Jill Hype Stevenson's analysis of an instance of double entendre in Mansfield Park that arguably demonstrates a sly awareness of anal sex. The moment in question occurs when Miss Crawford discusses her association with naval men during her childhood, and I'm quoting here, "Rears and vices, I saw enough. Now do not suspect me of a pun, I entreat." These sexually charged camp readings of Austen support Luce's witty claim that camp begets more camp. Her argument that the mere presence of camp leads to its own proliferation helps explain the sustained popular success of Austen adaptations in film and television. In response to this film and television obsession with Jane Austen, Rachel Bronstein refers to a period of Janeomania that began in the 90s when appetites for screen adaptations of Austen's novels were at an all-time high. She elaborates that the discreetly erotic appreciation for Austen's literature on screen began when a very wet Mr. Darcy emerges from a pond and startles Elizabeth Bennet into a conniption of orgasmic befuddlement, which you might remember in BBC's Pride and Prejudice miniseries, I Know I Did as a Kid. These kind of sexually inflected camp readings of Austen continue to this day, with Autumn de Wilde's recent adaptation of Emma that casts a voyeuristic view of Mr. Knightley's bare backside as a very dutiful manservant pulls up his stockings. For these reasons, Austen's novels and the multiple screen adaptations possess a dormant camp quality, be it vanilla and or sexually inflected, that I build upon in my new play, Hubris and Humiliation. So unlike, oh, do I need a slide? No, I don't. I'm going on. So unlike traditional adaptations, my play navigates less explored terrain by viewing Austen's body of work and the screen adaptations as a genre unto itself. As such, I imbue my play with the essence of Austen without being restrained by the strictures of a conventional adaptation. To do this, I apply a theory attributed to Pamela Robinson concerning how camp propagates itself, which I kind of casually call camp recycling. To explain, Robinson compares camp to the process of recycling as it appropriates outmoded objects and reconfigures them for a new purpose while still holding on to traces of the original. When it comes to writing in strobe, I consider this process of camp recycling vitally important because it essentially powers the entire mechanism. Only by adopting this process of camp recycling am I able to actually lay the groundwork for writing in strobe to occur. Yes. Now, for your own understanding, before I finally define writing in strobe, I will contextualize the central journey within the play, which is Eliot Delaney's journey in Hubris and Humiliation. So my characterization of Eliot partially recycles elements of Austen's heroines, particularly Sense and Sensibility's Elinor Dashwood, who possesses a coolness of judgment compared to her sister's excess of sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice's Elizabeth Bennet, whose courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate her. I probably also camp recycle versions of myself as well, but nevertheless will stick to Austen. So like many of the Austen's heroines, Eliot struggles to reconcile the relationship between his own personal failings, romantic desires, and the economic pragmatics of life. As such, Eliot's narrative arc reflects what Sidney Miller calls Austen's lessons of improvement, which is up on the slide, which you can read if you like. But from the outset of the story, Eliot's personal and financial circumstances are in dire need of such improvement. At the top of the play, Eliot discovers that his best friend and unrequited love, Warren, is now dating a hot daddy, and that his mother, Bernice, has been ripped off by a catfish. As such, the Delaneys are now facing eviction. Oh my God. With little hope on the horizon, Eliot hubristically agrees to move to Sydney, where he plans to marry the richest, gayest man in town and show everybody how much he's worth. And I'm quoting the play there. Well, I'm abridging it, but whatever. This journey ultimately leads to a series of humiliations that improves his character, his romantic prospects, and with it, the family's financial situation. So with all of this in mind, I will now define writing in strobe and suggest how it can be applied as a strategy for adaptation. Writing in strobe decenters realism and compels actors to adopt a parodic performance style that simultaneously undermines and relishes the genre elements instilled within the text. This style of writing implicitly compels the actors to balance or strobe between contradictory states of naive and deliberate camp awareness. Writing in strobe simultaneously appears faithful to genre, but also invites a discrete criticism of the conventions being manipulated for humor. To this point, Sam Abel observes, and I will read this because I just love the quote, precision is essential for camp, for in order to execute a critique of social norms, the camp artist must simultaneously achieve an embodiment of the target and a parody of it, living in the object and turning it upside down. I apply this terminology because of its association with Jaimin's concept of acting in strobe, which he derives from Deleuze's characterization of a particular composition principle that also happens to be called writing in strobe. It's kind of like an Escher painting of academia. Don't think too much about it. Nevertheless, so aspects of writing in strobe also feature in the work of Sisters Grimm. In their collaboration, Ash Flanders and Declan Green apply writing in strobe to intervene in canonical texts to create wildly camp plays that occupy a space somewhere between pastiche and homage, to quote from their website again. In Sarah French's analysis of Sisters Grimm's Summertime in the Garden of Eden, which in case you didn't see it, is a pastiche of the classic American Civil War film Gone with the Wind, she asserts that the play deploys non-normative and stylistic techniques to critically undermine the patriarchal, racist, and heteronormative ideas present within the source text. Examples of this can be found in the comic characterization of stereotypical white supremacist Southern landowner Big Daddy, which is played by a cis female actor in drag who bellows cliches like, "I do declare," while dressed in a white suit reminiscent of Colonel Sanders from KFC. Big Daddy's ludicrous joking spectacle also reflects Jack Halberstam's research into king humor, or kinging, which shares a tradition with camp that reads the dominant culture at a slant and explodes its effects through exaggeration, parody, and earnest mimicry. By kinging Big Daddy's bigotry, Sisters Grimm are able to embody and expose the ridiculous dimensions of these masculine stereotypes through the interplay of textual cliches and camp performance. This kind of camp intervention is reflected in Pamela de More's notion of queer adaptation, which she argues resists normative ideologies through revealing the fissures, absences, or silences in canonical texts. So, in my own work, Hubris and Humiliation appropriates conventions from Austen's classics to fuel the writing and stroke mechanism, while also foregrounding historically silenced queer subjects. As such, I'm able to manipulate the latent camp qualities within Austen to both mock and pay homage to her unmistakable style. Significant examples of this occur during the climactic end to Act 1 that takes place at the Baz Bash. So for context, the Baz Bash, hosted by Baz Luhrmann and Catherine Martin, is a fictional camp evocation of Austen's period that implicitly speaks to the play's central conceit, which is suggested by the party's theme, pride and pastiche, rebels of Regency and serious 19th century realness. This sequence is a strong example of how all the tenets of camp have been applied to inflate the vanilla and sexually inflected camp that lies dormant in Austen's fiction. However, this latent camp quality is exaggerated to such an extent that it exacerbates any pretense of realism, renders the situation preposterous, and disorientates binaries between naive and deliberate forms of camp awareness. So throughout this sequence, the interplay between the tenets of camp work together to illustrate Eliot as an incongruous version of an Austenian heroine. The association between Eliot and Austen's heroines is handled with more discretion early in the play. However, by putting Eliot in Regency drag, I conspicuously reveal the influence Austen has over the central character and by proxy the entire play. The script does not detail the particulars of Eliot's costume, but the stage directions suggest that he is transformed into a vision of modest beauty and restrained sexual yearning. And that's an image of Toby Blohm during the SDC rough draft development, which I think he's doing a good job of communicating the innocence and sexual yearning there. Anyway, this costuming decision gestures towards the tight bodices from the 1995 Pride and Prejudice miniseries and Keira Knightley's more down-to-earth costuming in Joe Wright's 2005 film adaptation of the novel. Ultimately, this moment of cross-gender identification implicitly inspires a performance quality to match Eliot's frock. The compound camp effects of this costuming decision unfold as Eliot enters the Baz Bash, and he speaks with his wise but dotty uncle with an air of camp theatricality. And now I act for you. Eliot and Roland arrive in Regency drag, fanning themselves throughout. This party is teeming with wealthy, eligible, practicing homosexuals. If the Baz Bash is anything like his films, then I suspect someone will instantly fall in love with me any moment now. All you need to do is cast your rod into the water, wait for a nibble, jerk the man in, and whack him over the head with a paddle. Ah! So in this moment, the dialogue walks a fine line between ironic parody and traditional pastiche, and my own performance does something else completely. And that is, Eliot's comments about the Baz Bash reveal that he is cognizant to the cliched position that he occupies, but then with a haughty cackle, he strobes into an enthusiastic embodiment of this new role. Moreover, the arch dialogue and excessively theatrical mise-en-scene delights in the genre conventions that are being reimagined, while also signaling they are in many respects preposterous. In turn, this indeterminable attitude towards the genre has the potential to disrupt how audiences interpret these familiar but outdated conventions. This scene reveals the ludicrousness of imagining Austen's genre in a contemporary queer Australian setting, without necessarily making a value judgment of the style and the social and political discourses embedded in her fiction. So audiences could speculate that as a playwright, I am ironically critiquing Austenian social protocols in order to undermine heteronormative relationship practices that are infiltrating queer lives since the advent of marriage equality. By extension, a case can be made that I'm making a broader claim that heteronormative courtship and matrimonial preoccupations are comically retrograde, and Eliot's Austen-inspired love quest humorously demonstrates this absurdity. However, in honesty, my own application of writing in strobe does not directly subvert the politics of queer marriage. Instead, I'm more operating from a more playful and joyful place, with the intention of presenting a disruption to all points of view by revealing both the joy and pitfalls of Eliot's journey. As such, the anxiety to form meaning I leave with the audience to resolve on their own terms, as each perspective I try to present as being both worthy and ridiculous. So I can't keep talking about the Baz Bash. I could go on forever and the play more broadly, but I'm mindful of time here, basically. But so to kind of, this covert sense of humor mirrors Austen's own style, which according to Bronstein is so accessible yet so strange because she insists on and undercuts such mutually constitutive oppositions as rich and poor, parent and child, self and duty, fact and fiction. Similarly, hubris and humiliation broadly supports yet undermines oppositional forces such as judicious reasoning and animal impulse, romantic love and pragmatic relationships, promiscuity and frigidity, queerness and heteronormativity. By recycling Austin's demode genre
Chris, that's 2
conventions,
minutes. Sorry,
thank
mate, that's
you.
2 minutes.
No, that's all good. I'll pick up the pace. This allows me to, I'm able to adopt traces of a style which is also indeterminately naive and deliberate in its use of camp. This allows me to magnify the latent camp within Austen to further reveal the artifice of the genre's construction, critique its contemporary relevance, and weaponize traces of the author's ambivalent perspective across a range of contemporary issues. As a result of reading Austen's work as camp, I began to more fully appreciate the ambiguities embedded in her singular voice that brilliantly riffs upon the play of opposites to generate variation. This interpretation of Austen's equivocal worldview connects with the camp tenet of writing in Strobe because it is predicated on the interplay of oppositional forces and perspectives. These ambiguities might explain why some camp is mistakenly seen as frothy, fun, and largely apolitical. However, beneath this glossy surface, this style is often muscular in its handling of contradictory perspectives as a means of interrogating complex questions without condescending its audience with didactic answers. As such, by preserving Austen's ambivalent perspective that resists platitudes, I've been able to humorously integrate ambiguities concerning personal conduct, the nature of love, queer politics, and so much more. Just a humble brag there. As such, writing in Strobe is a suitable technique to handle Austen's style that masterfully destabilizes all sides of the status quo through covert provocation, derision, and humor. So, spoiler alert, in the end, when Eliot accepts a proposal of marriage, the duality of writing in Strobe allows the audience to contemplate, is the playwright being tongue-in-cheek or wearing his heart on his sleeve? The way I see it, the answer can only be both at the same time with 100% commitment and a wry Austinian wink. As a strategy for adaptation, writing in Strobe presents a range of possibilities when perceiving the dormant camp potential within Australian novels. Through the process of camp recycling, it becomes possible to reimagine, subvert, or simply play with the conventions that reside within Australian novels and genres for people who might want to apply this in the future. If playwrights perceive novels or genres as camp, writing in Strobe can be implemented to simultaneously ridicule and celebrate aspects of the source material. As an adaptation strategy, writing in Strobe has the potential to dexterously handle a range of perspectives, as opposed to presenting an obviously sarcastic and satirical parody. Moreover, I contend that writing in Strobe can foment within an audience a deeper contemplation of complex questions and issues, which should always be handled with precision, rigor, and of course, a sense of humor. So thank you. And I'll take that down. And I now invite your questions.
Thanks so much, Lewis. Okay, so we've got a bit of a 5 minutes, just over 5 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to dive in. Yeah, Pierce, I see your hand up.
Hey, Lewis.
Hello.
I would love to see this play, number one. Number two, I'm just curious, it sounds to me like you're not just adapting Jane Austen, you're almost adapting the adaptations of Austen, and like the sort of cultural Austen mania makes this possible because everyone knows those tropes, everyone knows Darcy coming out of the pool almost better than they know the original novels themselves. And so I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about like, does this writing in Strobe, do you need something with an existing large cultural footprint and set of tropes around it, and almost pre-existing adaptations for you to do this methodology to it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there should be a cultural awareness of whatever you're adapting, because those things need to be familiar in order for them to be meaningfully subverted, I think, or to be just simply played with or celebrated. Whether that necessarily needs to translate into a proper adaptation from, like, say, the novel into a film or a miniseries, I don't necessarily think that's essential, but I definitely think that was a huge point of reference within writing this play, because I think that's how most people meet Austen for the first time as a sort of storyteller, is through those stories and through Darcy and the pool and everything like that. Which of course is kind of ripe with all of the camp that's already instilled within Austen itself, I speculate. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm just trying to think of what Australian examples exist of that. That's for other writers to come up with.
I was talking, like, I don't have a real theory here, but I was talking with my mother because she watched Eye of the Storm, the Patrick White novel, recently, and you know, I mean, on one level, there's a sort of performance quality within those types of stories that could be potentially a ripe area to explore.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Anyone else like to jump in?
I'll ask a question, Elliot, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Lewis. That was really interesting, and it's great to hear you talk about your work from the the point of confidence of someone who's submitted and can't make any further changes. But I'm interested in you describing to us what does it mean as a writer to employ this writing in strobe? If someone else wanted to sit down and try it, what would they do? How would they approach it? Can you talk us through the kind of process side?
I tried to communicate that within the presentation, but it is that process of camp recycling, which is basically being able to view something as camp. So the tenets of camp are a lens by which someone who may not have a language to perceive and understand camp can begin to pick things apart and see how it might be considered or read as camp. Within the literature, and obviously we talked about this a lot before, it is in many respects an instinctual practice. You sort of get camp if you get it. And sometimes it can be a kind of pain or an impossibility to really explain what camp is, or to convince someone to appreciate it unless it's sort of within them. But nevertheless, I do think the tenets of camp, which I've been taking from the literature, is a step towards actually having a language in which to discuss it. And then only after that, once you actually can begin to pick apart the source material and see it as camp, does it become possible, I believe, to start to write in strobe, because the question of deliberate and naive camp awareness does require a comprehensive understanding of all the different camp ways that something can be inflected within a text, or how you can bring that out. So I don't think it's a beginner camp strategy. I think you've got to sort of really know what you're doing.
Thanks, Lewis.
That's right.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Do we have any last questions? Last question for Lewis?
Lewis, I was just wondering, have you got plans for production up here at all?
I think you should ask other people if they have plans to do it.
Yes,
But no, yeah, like in the event, yeah, I would definitely want to see a production realized up here and in Sydney as well, because it's sort of a tale of both those cities. And whether that's in a shed somewhere or somewhere else, I will do it because I'm a masochist like that.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Lewis. That was great. We should probably get on because we've got time snipping at our heels. So yeah, virtual round of applause for Lewis. Our next paper is from Piers Wilcox, who's an independent scholar and whose paper is The Great Chain of Being, a librettist. So Piers, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay. Hello, my name is Piers. I'm coming to you from Sydney, so I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the traditional owners and the elders past, present and emerging. So I'm a librettist with a company called Sydney Chamber Opera, and I'm going to be doing a bit of a methodological retrospective on my own work and focusing around ideas of how people fit in landscapes, in the Australian landscape, and how adaptations can diverge from their originals in ways that advance the novel's core anxieties. So I'm talking about turning canonical Australian novels into opera. Opera tends to be a big form. There's a presumption that if you're going to throw that many resources at something, it should be telling some kind of large story. Here is an example of opera being big. This isn't always the case. Sydney Chamber Opera is a small company. We do smaller works. They may be small personal stories, but they tend to engage directly with questions of Australianness. What is an Australian story? How Australians fit into the world, and how the human entity fits into the landscape and history of this country. And the rather pompous name for this talk comes from that central question. Where do you fit in the great chain of being? What link are you in that chain? What's above you and what's below you, and can you move around? And it's also inspired by the rather surreal, incestuous fact of these novels in particular and my relationship to them. I made my name adapting Fly Away Peter, an Australian novel by David Malouf. He himself, years earlier, adapted Voss by Patrick White, and later I adapted Oscar and Lucinda, which is hugely indebted to Patrick White's novel and the associated opera. And here are those white men in question. There's Patrick White looking like he's about to tell you to get off his lawn. David looks a lot kinder. Peter Carey looks like he's about to ask you out. There's me dealing with my anxiety of influence. And to complete the circle, clearly I need to write a great Australian novel and someone needs to adapt to me. And then the cycle will go on forever. So what do these books have in common and why did they all get adapted into operas? I'm just going to go over their plots pretty quickly. There is a content warning that these plots include violence against First Nations people and mentions of suicide. So Voss is about a foreign explorer, Voss. He arrives in mid-1800s Sydney. He forms a passionate and mostly unspoken attachment with a woman named Laura before he sets off on a foolhardy expedition to map the continent. She sees him off, he goes in the outback with a bunch of weirdos. They all go mad, it ends horribly. And back home, Laura hears about his death. Oscar and Lucinda is about a foreign priest, Oscar, who arrives in mid-1800s Sydney. He forms a passionate and mostly unspoken attachment with a businesswoman, Lucinda, before he sets off on a foolhardy expedition to sail a glass church up a river. She sees him off. They all go mad, it ends horribly, but also kind of by accident. And back home, she hears about his death. Flyaway Peter is about an Australian birdwatcher named Jim, who's living in 1910s southeast Queensland. He forms a passionate and mostly unspoken attachment to a bunch of birds, but he also befriends an older woman named Imogen and a landowner named Ashley, before he and Ashley set off on a foolhardy expedition to fight in World War I. Imogen sees them off, they head into the trenches, they all go mad, it ends horribly. And back home, she hears about his death. Beyond these superficial plot similarities, all of these novels are interested in the navigation of landscapes. Internal landscapes as well as emotional ones. Internal landscapes as well as physical ones. It's that core idea, as opposed to them having intricate plots, complicated reversals, that made them appealing for adaptation into opera, at least to me as a librettist, and to the composer I worked with on Oscar and Lucinda and Flyaway Peter, Elliot Geiger. Because opera isn't a dialogue form. These aren't stories that rely heavily on dialogue. These are stories about people moving across landscapes while they look at things and they think about things. And Elliot, in an interview about Flyaway Peter, said this, that thought is opera's home terrain, in a way, not only thoughts that are voiced, but thoughts that are unvoiced. And the things they're thinking about are often about that landscape they're moving through and their place within it, about where they fit in relation to the land, to this land, their place in that chain. They are also sometimes thinking about the nature of God. And this is a common trope of nationalistic art making. The post-colonial critic, Homi Bhabha, identifies that there is a recurrent metaphor of landscape as the inscape of nationalism. He was talking about Goethe, talking about Italians, but he's basically saying that what we see in the land reflects the inner nature of the self, in this case, the nation's self, that it's lush or inviting or dangerous. This is hardly a complicated or a new idea, but it's a point that all these novelists have troubles with. It's a place they start from and then they leave to go somewhere else. And it's one of those things that we as adapters had to grapple with as well. So how do the novels reckon with landscape and how do our adaptations do the same? Each book stars characters who lay claim to the land of Australia, and those claims are contested or rejected. And this is done most obviously through the making of maps in these colonial times. There's quite a famous line in Voss that sums up its approach. Voss, the explorer's benefactor, Mr. Bonner, says, "Have you studied the map?" And Voss says, "The map, I will first make it." He's going to chart the uncharted territory of Central Australia. He's going to lay claim to these spaces. In Oscar and Lucinda, this sentiment belongs to the villainous Mr. Jeffress. It's one of the key lines that we gave him. He's kind of the leader of the expedition that Oscar's going on, and he sings, "Map the land, know the earth," as they all set out. And then later he's killed by Oscar, rightfully so on a lot of levels. And one of his last lines is, "My map." The thing that he's losing is his chance to make a map. So he's a lot more fixated on maps in the opera than he is in the novel. And in Fly Away Peter, we made this idea present in the very first lines, where Jim, the bird watcher, sings, "See the bird, from below I watch it rise, see the land, from above I map its life." Unlike those explorers, Jim isn't interested in conquering or even really moving. He's a bird watcher. He wants to observe, he wants to look at things. And he's only interested in mapping life, where the birds go. He knows the area, and so the person who technically owns the land, actually Crowther, at least according to the Crown's laws, he offers him the chance to chart it and turn it into a bird sanctuary. But he doesn't get the chance because war breaks out. So if the landscape is the national self, and you need to make a map of it, it means the nation is unknown. It doesn't know who it is yet. These are all novels of an emergent nation, and yet they're written in the 20th century, 100+ years after these issues. These mapping projects were actually happening in history. So it bears mentioning that all of these projects in these books end in failure. The map is not made, and the country in these books still doesn't know what or who it is. But it's important to note that these are all colonial stories because map making is ultimately an imperial project. J.B. Harley, the great historian of cartography, articulates that maps are a way of inscribing power on the land. And in his essay, Deconstructing the Map, he says, since the Renaissance, maps, have changed the ways in which power was exercised. In colonial North America, for example, it was easy for Europeans to draw lines across the territories of Indian nations without sensing the reality of their political identity. And the map allowed them to say, this is mine. These are the boundaries. So the map allows you to claim territory that isn't actually yours. But we know that there are other maps that existed. This is the famous map of First Nations. First Nations people knew where things were. That information wasn't just kept in atlases on the desks of colonial governors. So all of these landscapes, these supposedly unknown, unmapped landscapes, they were of course already inhabited, already known by First Nations people. And that's something that all of the stories collide with in different ways, as I'll come to towards the end. So if landscape is the core question of these novels, how did the specific form of opera deal with landscape? You would think that opera is a particularly poor form to reckon with space, with journeys across landscapes, as opposed to, say, film. Because on film, you can show a person in a landscape. You can say, look how big this valley is. A person was there, now they're here. On stage, you can have a revolve, or if you're very lucky, always digital screens. But the central feature of opera is time dilation. Meaning that you can stretch time. You can dive into a character's emotional state rather than being wedded to the literal passage of time as in a naturalistic play. And now, of course, plays can do this, films can play with time. They often use music to do it because music has a distinctive ability to stretch time and the human perception of time. And the composer Jack Simons, who founded Sydney Chamber Opera, has this line where he talks about how music can fold time. It can fuse it and freeze it. And if I learned one thing from Interstellar, it's that time and space are part of the same fabric. In bending time, you can bend space. You can punch a wormhole through the map. So in Fly Away Peter, we introduced a slippage in space-time. There's a scene where Ashley offers to take Jim up in his airplane so they can look at the land from above. But the Queensland coast they're flying over collapses into the sea and then into the fields of Europe as the war starts and the airplane becomes a bomber that's bombing the trenches. In the novel, these are discrete sections. Ashley has a plane, they go for a flight. Then later, Jim goes to Brisbane, he gets on a ship. Then later, he arrives at the front. But we wanted to capture the sense of things slipping out of control by blurring all of this together. Similarly, in Oscar and Lucinda, the expedition, not that yet, starts in Sydney and then it heads overland. We didn't change the trajectory, but we did blur and blend it into more of a phantasmagoria. It's a word we used a lot. As Oscar is getting dosed with laudanum, that sort of shapes the experience that is being presented. What that literally means is lots of fragmented and overlapping text in the libretto and in the sung lines of music, which of course isn't what happens in the novel. Language doesn't break down in the book, but on stage it does as we rise to a climax. And in both of these adaptations, the performers are moving between character and narrator, often by sharing lines. So they're in their own separate worlds, then they come together to reflect a moment of shared experience. That is also kind of a choral reflection on what's happening. So Mr. Jeffress sings the word cut because he wants to cut through the bush, and Oscar sings the word cut because he wants to cut himself. It's worth mentioning that the novel Oscar and Lucinda actually has a narrator, Oscar's descendant, telling the story many years later, and we cut this entirely. Jeffrey Rush does a voiceover narration in the film version, and this casts kind of too much of a shadow, and that figure exerts too much of a gravitational pull on the story. So instead, we had a choral narrator and echoed the approach we use in Fly Away Peter, which each singer can take on a sort of poetic, descriptive voice at times. A challenge across all three of the operas is, what do you do with the female lead who's been left behind? In Vosk, Oscar and Lucinda, and Fly Away Peter, there's an intellectual and emotional communion between the male lead who's off on the journey and the female lead who's left at home. Though practically speaking, they disappear from the story for big chunks before coming back to mourn at the end. And in Fly Away Peter, we wanted to break down those boundaries. We wanted to break down the borders on the maps. So we had the singer that plays Imogen, the friend back home, voice a reminder, a memory of the birds that Jim sees in Australia, and then the same birds on the fields of France where he's fighting. She also plays the German army. The voice of the home front becomes the voice of the enemy, and she sings "See the men from Germany" in German, as Jim sings "See the men" in English. Then later she's a voice counting down like a doomsday clock as shells rain on them. And later the tenor who plays Ashley, he voices a machine gun. It's a profoundly anti-war book, so we wanted the lines of character to break down as the notion of separate humanity broke down. Body parts dissolve into earth, and it doesn't really matter who's on which side anymore. Even as the imperial masters want to maintain the borders, they're all falling apart. And on stage, this was realized through all of this clay that was smeared over the performers, making them look physically indistinguishable. We did the opposite in Oscar and Lucinda. Lucinda's been, and that's him getting all clay. Lucinda's been on stage for pretty much the entire opera, and she leaves as Oscar goes on his voyage. Instead, there's a female voice in the chorus, sung by the wonderful Jane Sheldon. And she later will become a woman called Miriam Chadwick, who Oscar meets at his destination. So Lucinda is trapped in one space, and it's Miriam, a new character, who can sort of slide across the landscape to foreshadow where he's going. I want to wrap up by talking about the consequences of those two voyages, two climactic acts of violence, and ways that we broke from the novels. In Oscar and Lucinda, there are repeated encounters with a First Nations group along the journey, including a character nicknamed Billy. And there's a chapter where, for the only time in the voice, the narrator's voice switches to Billy. And it reads, honestly, as a fairly awkward attempt at literary blackface. There's a sort of simple English talk going on. And Billy describes an awful encounter that ends with the white travelers shooting some of the Indigenous locals. And Oscar objects to the massacre, and he's tied up. He later kills Jeffress, the perpetrator of the murders, in a brawl. And as adapters, we were told, the singers that we were working with early on, and none of them were First Nations people. So instead of literally doing blackface, we decided that these people, who Kerry calls the Naku, they wouldn't be seen on stage. Jeffress says to shoot any natives who get in the way. He later says cut down the tribe, and unknown figures are fired upon, unseen figures rather. But nobody realized how fast the music was until rehearsals, and this moment went by in a few seconds. And one of the performers called us out on this and said, hold on, we need to acknowledge this somehow. This is the worst thing that happens in the entire story. So they inserted a silence of about 20, 30 seconds, in which there's no music, there's no lines, there's nothing. There's just Oscar reacting and showing his grief at what happens, and that's what drives him to a suicide attempt. To be really reductive, in the absence of Black voices, that production showed white guilt and made space for a white audience to feel their own guilt in that silence. I think that was maybe the best answer of Bad Bunch, but considering everything I've been saying about maps and the colonial project in these texts, this is a moment where I think there are better answers. That's just some people singing. It's worth mentioning this moment was pretty well received critically, despite being quite a departure from the source text. There's no page of emptiness in the novel. The massacre is moved past very quickly in the novel. A less well-received adaptation choice came in the end of Fly Away Peter. There's an aria belonging to Imogen back home who's watching a surfer. Now we know that Jim, the bird watcher, he went over the top in the trenches and he had a vision of meeting Ashley on the other side. in the novel, there's this tremendous line where Imogen kind of mentions in passing that she's heard of Jim's death. It's this great modernist gesture, like the similar death of Andrew Ramsay in Wolf to the Lighthouse. In the opera, we wanted there to be this terrible drumbeat to show all the men who had died, leading up to Jim, but not just Jim, and not just Australians. So the tenor, the male singer that isn't Jim, he lists off every other named soldier character underneath Imogen's aria, but I interspersed them with names from real lists of war dead that I took from cenotaphs around the world on all sides. So there's a Turkish name, or I guess an Ottoman name, a German, an Algerian, a French name. And this was criticized by a reviewer who said that the excess I took exception to was Wilcox's attempt to make the opera universal, with a sentimental authorial intrusion at odds with the novels, and largely the opera's, masterful realization of Jim and Ashley's limited worlds. And now I mention this not just because every word of a bad review is etched on my soul forever, but because this attempt to push past or break down the boundaries of the map was one that didn't seem to succeed. And I think it leads to my fundamental question about adaptation. Often we see adaptation described as offering one view of the original. So the original is this infinite text, and readers can go back to it if they're displeased that it didn't match their interpretation. But I've always thought of the boon of adaptation being that you can open out space. It is a many-authored text, more open in the Umberto Eco sense than the, yeah, cheers.
2 minutes.
Easy. Yeah, the adaptation is actually more open in the Umberto Eco sense than the closed text of a novel, which has a single author. In Oscar and Lucinda, we literally opened a space of silence. In Fly Away Peter, we folded spaces, times, and identities together, like someone has folded this book. And they folded this book into the word read, but in doing so, they rendered the book unreadable. So that's a metaphor for something. I don't know which understanding of adaptation is right. I don't know whether it's a good thing politically to open more space for contemporary interventions in an old book, or to embrace that closed-offness of the classic text as an accurate vision of the world at that time, if we want to tell the truth about the past and about these novels. This is the beginning of a longer project, so I don't know the answer. And I'm interested if anyone has suggestions for further reading about space and maps and empire, which sort of sounds like a Star Wars film, now that I say it. And if anyone has questions, that's me. Thank you so much. Ahead of schedule.
Bingo. Thanks, Pierce. That was terrific. So yeah, lots of questions. Well, I've got lots of questions, but open to the floor. Who would like to jump in?
Oh, thanks, Pierce. That was awesome. I just had a question about your work with the composer, and you mentioned about the fact that when you first brought the scene of the massacre to the performers, they said it was quite far. The music was very fast. And was that something that you know, how closely do you work with the composer, and was that something that you'd both kind of come to the table with, or was that something that was kind of thrust upon you after you had written the libretto?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way we worked is that obviously heaps of back and forth about structure and character and plotting and all that sort of thing. And I would kind of gesture towards rhythmic questions in the setting of the lines. I don't know if you saw on the page that there would be big spaces, there would be, you know, stuff, little slashes. And that was me kind of gesturing towards there should be a rest here, maybe this should be kind of slow and melodic, but ultimately it was up to the composer, it was up to Elliot. And, you know, we talked about the scene being quite manic, but the specific rhythms of it, yeah, didn't know till we got into the rehearsal room. And also I think the really weird thing about New Opera is that we were operating on quite a short timetable. He was writing the scenes, they were going to piano, but you don't get the whole orchestra until the Sitzprobe, which is like a couple of days before opening. So even hearing what the texture of the work is musically on a really basic level, like does it sound sad, does it sound happy? You don't get that almost until opening night, because you're hearing a piano reduction getting played, which might sound faster or angrier or sadder or whatever than what it actually is. And that really throws directors and performers. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
Okay, any further questions? Who else would like to jump in?
Stephen's got a question here. Sorry, jumping in.
Stephen.
So it's more of an observation or a suggestion as well to that core piece. I love that paper. That's fantastic. And I love the that area that you're heading down, the kind of dual occupation of space and Indigenous and non-Indigenous layering of the same spaces, and just some other people who have been writing in that space. Joanne Tompkins here has a book called Unsettling Australia that looks at that, and also Ken Galder and Jane Jacob have used the Freudian sense of the uncanny to talk about that. Those two ways of knowing and occupying space. So you might want to, I don't know, maybe explore it's Uncanny Australia is their text as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so useful. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Any other questions or comments for Piers?
No, I just wanted to add that I think that my question to Lewis has almost kind of been answered by my own paper, because I think like Patrick White is particularly right for that strobing that Lewis talked about. Those particular like old white male authors writing these stories of explorers and that sort of thing. That's a whole bunch of tropes that I think Lewis's camp adaptation could be applied to. So yeah.
Piers, Daniel has a question in the chat. Daniel asks, so much of classic Australian literature has an absence of First Nations voices. After your experience with that moment in Oscar and Lucinda, what ways would you consider approaching this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really important question. I think it's a kind of fundamental one if you're going to adapt these older texts. You know, the simple answer is maybe I shouldn't be the one to adapt it. As you saw from those images, I look exactly the same as those old guys, although I don't look as angry as Patrick White. That having a multiplicity of voices in rehearsal rooms and in development processes is really important. Like on a very basic level, I worked on an adaptation of an ancient Greek set of poems, and there was a female Greek dramaturg, and like that changed the process a great deal. So we didn't have a great diversity of voices in the room, and I think that's a problem in opera in general. It's a very white form, and yeah, even the question of like who is singing, what kind of performers can you write for is really difficult. So yeah, I think that because it is a form that places emphasis on a specifically European technique of singing, maybe that needs to be bent and opened a bit in order to make space for other voices to be included, as you see in something like The Rabbits, which doesn't have conventional opera singers in it, but is, I think, a very acclaimed adaptation. Yeah. But yeah, it always starts with cultural consultation, and I don't think we did that very well, to be quite honest.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. Piers, I actually just have one little suggestion. You asked for reading that might be helpful in tackling, well, I guess responding to that criticism on the, well, what that reviewer anyway thought was that universalizing gesture, the, you know, breaking down those boundaries, national boundaries that existed very strongly at that time. I thought you might, it's a different medium, and but it's the same problem. A film scholar, Gilberto Perez, has a really interesting book called The Rhetoric of Film. And in the opening chapter of that, he looks at a John Ford film and considers Ford's honesty in having his heroic characters who otherwise seem to be able to defy the currents of their time, nevertheless being trapped within the racism of the US in the 1800s, now, whenever. So rather than trying to pretend like there were people who were able to kind of be like us and step outside of those constraints, or like us, he just acknowledges that this is what it was, you know, these are what people like. So that could be worth having a look at.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And definitely Ford and the Western came up in the reading I was doing about map making.
Yeah, well,
so in terms of like stories of the frontier.
Yeah, it also made me think of I guess political liberalism and kind of imagining a world without borders.
Yeah.
And the universalizing tenets of liberalism are kind of a problem here as well. So that's an interesting tension, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Again, time's always nipping at our heels in this session. Our next speaker is Catherine Marquet from UQ. Her paper is Securing the Future by Reimagining the Past, The Secret Garden, Steampunk, and Adaptation for Ideological Change in Young Audiences. So thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Elliot. And thanks for taking the time to be here, those of you who are watching, listening. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I'm on, the Quandamooka people, and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. Like many of my contemporaries, I've been grappling for some time with how theatre can respond to the climate emergency and the rapid destruction of living things in our world. In 2014, I began working on a radical adaptation of Frances Hodgson Burnett's classic children's novel, The Secret Garden. By placing environmental destruction and interconnectedness front and center within the adaptation, the eco-critical themes and ideas of The Secret Garden become explicit and encourage audiences to grapple with notions of environmental responsibility. Author and eco-critic Val Plumwood states, "The problem is not primarily about more knowledge or technology. It's about developing an environmental culture that values and fully acknowledges the non-human sphere and our dependency on it." In other words, science and technology can only be useful if they come hand in hand with significant cultural and social change. And I believe theatre has an important role to play in this change. And the garden adaptation is one example that attempts to communicate eco-critical messages to its audience. The overarching metaphor within both the original Secret Garden and my adaptation is that humans must nurture and respectfully coexist with the natural world in order to be whole within themselves. Today, I'd like to share with you the theoretical underpinnings of my adaptation of The Secret Garden, which formed the basis for research undertaken during the completion of my Master's in Creative Writing here at the University of Queensland. I'll focus on notions of eco-criticism and the radical adaptation of place and landscape within the story, from imperialist Edwardian England to a fantasy steampunk dystopia for Australian audiences.